Hey, stop what you are doing, because what I'm about to tell you is not just a Canada story. It is not just a Trump story. What is actually unfolding right now is the quiet collapse of an alliance that the entire Western world has taken for granted since 1945. And once you see the full picture, you cannot unsee it. My name is Alex, and I need you to stay with me through every single minute of this, because the part that nobody is talking about, the part that genuinely shocked me when I dug into it, comes later. And trust me, you want to get there. Let me start with something that sounds almost too simple. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border on Earth, over 5,500 miles. No walls, no military checkpoints, no armed standoffs. For more than 100 years, that border was the physical symbol of something the world had rarely seen before. Two nations so deeply trusting of each other that they literally left the door open. That is gone now. Not the border, the trust. And here is what most coverage gets completely wrong about why. People are framing this as a trade dispute. Tariffs in, tariffs out, some diplomatic tension. Eventually a deal gets made and everyone moves on. That is not what this is. What broke the Canada-US relationship was not the tariffs. The tariffs were painful, yes. They hit Canadian industries hard. But Canadian governments have navigated trade friction with Washington before. What actually broke it, what crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, was the open public suggestion by the President of the United States that Canada should become the 51st American state. I want you to think about what that statement does inside a government, because it is not just offensive, it is strategically destabilizing in a way that most people have not fully processed. The moment a country's most powerful partner starts publicly questioning whether that country should exist as an independent nation, every single security assumption that government has ever made becomes unreliable overnight. Every defense agreement, every intelligence sharing arrangement, every trade framework, all of it suddenly sits on a foundation that may not hold. And when a government reaches that conclusion, it does not wait around to see if things improve. It starts building exits, quietly, methodically. And that is exactly what Mark Carney has been doing. Now, here is where I need you to pay close attention, because this is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. Carney is not a politician who stumbled into a crisis and started improvising. This is a man who ran the Bank of Canada, then ran the Bank of England through the 2008 financial crisis and through Brexit. His entire career has been about identifying systemic risk before it becomes a catastrophe and building structural solutions that outlast the immediate problem. When Carney looks at the Canada-US relationship right now, he has not seen a diplomatic dispute. He has seen a systemic risk. And he is responding the way central bankers respond to systemic risk. Not with speeches, not with press conferences, with architecture. Structural changes designed to make the system more resilient, regardless of what any individual political actor does next. And I want to walk you through exactly what that architecture looks like, because the breadth of it will genuinely surprise you. The piece that gets the most attention is the F-35 review. And I understand why. Canada was committed to purchasing $27 billion worth of F-35 stealth fighters from the United States. Carney is now seriously considering canceling that purchase and replacing it with the Swedish Saab Gripen E, manufactured inside Canadian factories. That single decision, if it goes through, would be the loudest signal any American ally has ever sent to Washington about the state of the relationship. But here is what most analysts miss about that move. The fighter jet is almost secondary. What Carney is actually building with that deal is a Canadian defense manufacturing ecosystem that does not depend on American supply chains, American technology transfers, or American political goodwill. Once that ecosystem exists, it cannot easily be dismantled by a future government, even if that government wants to restore closer ties with Washington. That is what I mean when I say Carney is building one-way doors, and the fighter jet is just one of them. On critical minerals, Canada holds some of the largest deposits on Earth of materials that the entire modern economy runs on: lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements essential for batteries, semiconductors, advanced weapon systems, and the artificial intelligence hardware that every major power is now racing to build. For decades, the default assumption was that those resources would flow primarily into the American industrial base. Carney is now renegotiating that default. Germany and France, both running ambitious industrial strategies of their own, are being brought in as primary partners for Canadian critical mineral development. And here is the part that should make Washington genuinely nervous. The Europeans are not just buying the minerals. They are investing in the processing infrastructure inside Canada. That means jobs. That means technology transfer. That means a permanent industrial relationship that will be extraordinarily difficult to unwind. Every processing facility built with European capital is another one-way door. On artificial intelligence infrastructure, Canada is one of the world's leading hubs for AI research. The University of Toronto, the Vector Institute, Montreal's AI ecosystem, these are genuinely world-class institutions that every major tech power wants access to. Carney is now steering that capacity toward European collaboration frameworks rather than deeper American integration. On energy, Canadian exporters are actively exploring new pipeline and LNG infrastructure to reach European markets, particularly as European nations work to permanently reduce dependence on Russian supply. On regulatory standards, Canadian frameworks are being quietly aligned with European Union norms in ways that will make transatlantic commerce smoother and North American integration more complicated over time. Each of these moves individually looks like a policy adjustment. Together, they look like a country methodically rewiring its entire strategic nervous system. And then came Armenia. And this is the moment I keep coming back to because I think it is the most significant thing any Western leader has said publicly in years. And it has been almost completely ignored by mainstream coverage. At a recent leaders' summit, Prime Minister Carney stood up and declared that the rules-based international order, the entire framework of alliances and institutions and norms that has governed the Western world since 1945, must now be rebuilt out of Europe, anchored by Canada, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Let that land for a second. The rules-based international order must be rebuilt. Not defended, not maintained, rebuilt. And the anchor of that rebuilt order in Carney's vision is not Washington. It is not NATO headquarters. It is a coalition of Canada, Europe, Britain, and Australia. A coalition that conspicuously does not include the United States at its center. Washington read that statement as a direct challenge to American hegemony. They are not wrong. But here's what I think is even more significant than the statement itself. Nobody pushed back. Not publicly. Not from the European side, not from the British side, not from Australia, which tells you that Carney did not say that in a vacuum. He said it because he had already had enough private conversations with enough allied leaders to know that the sentiment would land. That is not improvisation. That is the public articulation of a consensus that had already been building privately for months. And now here is what I want you to think about, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who cares about American strategic position. The Trump administration's entire approach to Canada was built on a foundational assumption that geographic and economic reality would always function as a leash, that no matter how much friction Washington created, Ottawa would eventually have to come back to the table because the alternative was simply too costly. That assumption is being stress tested right now in real time. And the early results are not encouraging for Washington, because what Trump's pressure actually produced was not a more compliant Canada. It produced a Canada where every major political faction, conservative, liberal, provincial, federal, is aligned around strategic independence from the United States. It produced a Canadian public that polling shows will accept economic pain in exchange for reduced American dependence. It produced a prime minister with a public mandate to build one-way doors. Aggressive pressure against a proud democratic nation does not produce compliance. It produces exactly this: consolidated resistance with a popular mandate. And here is the strategic problem that Washington has not yet adequately grappled with. Canada is not just responding to Trump. Canada is setting a precedent. If Ottawa successfully reorients meaningful portions of its trade and strategic relationships toward Europe without catastrophic economic damage, it creates a template that every other American ally currently running quiet internal calculations about Washington's reliability will study in exhaustive detail. Tokyo is watching, Seoul is watching, Warsaw is watching, Mexico City is watching. A Canadian success story in strategic diversification would be studied the way the Marshall Plan was studied. as proof that large-scale structural realignment is possible even for deeply integrated partners. The implications for American global position are serious, and they extend far beyond any single bilateral relationship. I want to be genuinely honest with you about the constraints here, because I think that honesty is what separates real analysis from cheerleading. Canada does roughly 70 to 75% of its total trade with the United States. That number represents over a century of integrated supply chains, cross-border manufacturing partnerships, shared energy infrastructure, and logistical networks that cannot be rewired in a political term or two. Even the most optimistic projections from Ottawa's own planners only bring that figure down to around 60 to 65% over 4 to 5 years. The economic pain of this transition will be real, and it will be felt by ordinary Canadian families, not just by policy architects in Ottawa. Europe is a market of 450 million consumers with an economy that rivals America's, yes. But European supply chains are not currently configured to absorb Canadian exports at scale. Building those linkages takes time, capital, and political will on both sides of the Atlantic. And Europe has its own internal tensions, its own political instabilities, and its own competing priorities that will not always align with Canadian needs. Carney is making a bet, a serious, well-researched, strategically sophisticated bet. But it is still a bet, and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the direction. The trajectory has been set. The one-way doors are being built. And the world that existed before, the world where the Canada-US relationship was the unchallenged gold standard of international partnerships, that world is not coming back, regardless of what happens in the next American election cycle. What I find most striking when I step back from all of this is not the geopolitics. It is the human dimension of what a government deciding to take its own sovereignty seriously actually looks like in practice. It looks like engineers in Stockholm sitting across a table from Canadian procurement officials talking about fighter jet factories in Ontario. It looks like German industrial strategists flying to Ottawa to negotiate mineral processing agreements. It looks like a Canadian Prime Minister standing up at an international summit and saying out loud what most allied leaders have only been saying in private. It looks like a country that spent a century assuming its most important relationship was permanent, deciding that assumption is no longer safe to hold. History will render a verdict on whether Carney's bet was right, whether the economic costs were manageable, whether Europe proved to be the reliable partner Ottawa is counting on, whether the American political pendulum eventually swings back in a direction that makes the Canada-US relationship recoverable. None of that is settled, but the bet has been placed. The architecture is being built. And the most important strategic realignment in the Western world since the end of the Cold War is unfolding right now, quietly, methodically, one-way door at a time. If you want to understand what is actually happening in the world at this level of depth, not just the surface headlines, but the structural forces underneath them, then subscribe and turn on notifications. Every video I put out here is built the same way. Find the story underneath the story. Show you what it actually means. See you in the next one.